Hello, everyone. Welcome to Revolutionary Health. I'm Charles Stevens, and I'm joined with
David Malebranche. Welcome, y'all.
the amazing doctor, activist, revolutionary scholar. What else do we have?
Absolutely. And sitting next to the amazing Charles Stevens. I'm blessed to be here.
All right. We love that you're joining us on Facebook Live. So please feel free to chime in the comments. As always, we love to hear from you. Feel free to also tweet at us on Twitter at Building Desire. You can also reach out to us there as well. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please, please, please click on the little bell and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Um, oh, and we're almost at 100 subscribers, so we should probably think of something to do
Yeah.
once we hit 100.
Should we have like a drawing for
should we have a
next
drawing?
week?
No, I'm gonna do a drawing. What else?
We could give away
We should do
counter-narrative,
something-
counter-narrative paraphernalia.
We should do a special program.
Okay.
Something.
On what?
I don't know.
Okay, we'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out.
But when is 100 subscribers?
We're almost there. We just need to like 6 more
Where we
or
at?
something.
Okay.
Like 94. Or
So
something.
please subscribe to our YouTube
Once
channel.
we
Get us to 100 and we'll do
get us to
something
100.
special.
Yeah.
Okay. That sounds good.
All right. So this evening we're gonna have a pretty heavy discussion. So we really, really, really want you all to share the space with us in the comments because we're really going to be looking to you to also help share insights, pose questions, and we invite you to also share some of your experiences. But this evening, we're actually talking about suicide and how it impacts our community. And I realized that we talked a little bit about mental health, a little bit about depression, but we just really wanted to dedicate this particular show to talk about suicide. And it just seems like there's so much happening in our community.
Right.
And I keep hearing these stories. And so we wanted to create space to be able to share some of that. So I guess we should just begin with.
Yeah, we can get into it. I think there are cycles in social media where we kind of see these stories and, Black, gay circles and enclaves, there's 1 degree of separation typically in the United States. So you're usually like one person away from knowing somebody else. And so a lot of times there'll be cycles where I see on my timeline, like so-and-so died, so-and-so died. And just it seemed like recently there were about maybe 2 to 3 young brothers that I saw that were actually, had committed suicide. And though I didn't know them personally, I had friends who knew these men. And so I think we wanted to kind of create a space where we could talk about suicide and be honest about it, be forthcoming as far as what are some of the things that are kind of going on in our lives that impact us, impact our mental health, and get us to the point where we feel there's no way out and we would take our own lives. We'd be willing to take our own lives. How to prevent it, what we should do in those situations as friends and families, brothers and uncles and fathers and sons of other loved ones in the gay community, and just kind of figure out what we can do. And I have a feeling for some reason talking about this topic will take more than one show.
Yeah.
So I imagine we'll probably have a follow-up on this based on kind of the conversations that you guys have, some of the topics that we bring up. And then if you guys want to share and be vulnerable, and we'll have this space so you can be vulnerable. We'll be as vulnerable as we can be in discussing this, how it's impacted us personally, professionally, how it's impacted our circles, and go from there.
Absolutely. And I think one of the questions that we were just talking about before we started filming was, how do you approach somebody that you think might be struggling? Sometimes we'll see people post things on social media, on Facebook, where they're struggling. How do we support them? How do we I know sometimes people might comment on posts and things like that, because often we might not have their number, we may not know how to reach them directly.
Right.
So we had just started talking about different ways to support, and I don't know if there's a wrong way. I want to believe that just having a community behind you is just so important.
Right. And it's hard to say which way would help people, because some people will post stuff on Facebook or Instagram or another Twitter, and it's a call out for help, and then people will respond. But I think in those spaces, while we're connected through social media, we are kind of disconnected personally. So it may take more than sending you prayers and hugs, or sending you love, or DM me if you want to. It may take a phone call. It may take for you to go to that person's house, or to call a family member if you know them, or do some of those things. So, when we see those of us in the community kind of, reaching out for help and saying like, hey, I need some help. I'm really struggling here. Not that it's a wrong way. I don't think it's a wrong way to reach out. Definitely you want to send those messages on social media. But I think in a lot of cases, it may take a little bit more than that, to kind of reach out and pull somebody when they're really struggling like that.
One of the questions, and I see some folks joining us, Justin and James and Art. Art is wishing me a happy born day from last week.
Yay.
I don't know what it means to support folks. Let me back up. There's this conversation about mental health, and there's this conversation about depression and suicide. But I mean, what does it mean when your poor mental health is caused by racism and homophobia?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know, because I think a lot of times the conversation is very behavioral, or it may be about relationships, or it may be. But what about structural violence?
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean? I mean, I know for me in my own life, I think I've struggled the most. I think the period in my life when I struggled the most around mental health stuff was when I was experiencing the most heightened aggressive structural violence, especially when I was very young. And I didn't feel like I had a lot of agency. I felt like things were just happening to me, and so. But I don't know if we have a language around the impact and beyond just accepting your sexual. If you accept your sexuality, then you won't be sad anymore.
Right.
But really thinking very broadly about like, what does it mean to be Black and gay in this country,
right,
and how there's so many forces. Like, how do you respond to that from a mental health perspective?
Yeah, I think it's challenging, and I think because these forces are so huge, we can't really stop them. So it's almost like the onus is on us. So people will say, and I know we're trained a lot of times, particularly as Black men, to say, well, suck it up or tough it out. And there are these kind of like messages that we get when we're growing up. Don't cry, don't deal with it. Don't cry, don't let somebody in, don't be vulnerable, don't show any weakness. And so we carry these things with us as we grow up, and we think those are the best ways to adapt to when we face adversity, and they may not be. And so, we've talked a few times, I think, on this show about the whole issue of resilience. Yeah. And there are many people I know in the audience out there, and in a lot of circles where people talk about, Black gay men and Black people, just be resilient and be stronger. And I'm like, well, resilience is an interesting concept because it's great because it shows you can overcome some adversity or some structural violence. But if you don't call the structural violence for what it is, and then you just put the onus on the person, like you have to be stronger, you have to be better than that, then that's what makes the person explode at some point. That's what makes the person get to a point where they don't feel, because you constantly have this pressure that you have to be stronger, you have to make it through. And no one calls the origin of why you're dealing with a lot of this stuff on its own shit. And so it's hard. And I think it's not saying that resilience as a concept is a bad thing, but I think we have to kind of step away from that's the answer for all our problems. Yeah.
Remember how we were talking I want to share with the audience about how sometimes we assume that just because someone can articulate or describe that they're going through stuff, that they're going to be okay. It's something like if they're able to talk about it, if they're able to share their struggles,
right.
But we don't think about like what happens when they go home.
Right.
We don't think about what happens when they're with themselves, that it's ongoing.
Yeah. And the example, and it was really uncanny. We were talking about this and we were going through some emails, and Charles emailed me about this brother that he knew his name. I think you thought his name was Reggie at first, and you said, I knew somebody who jumped off the San Francisco Bridge, or the Golden Gate Bridge, back in the early 2000s. Yeah. And when he said the name, I said, I knew immediately. I was like, I don't think it's Reggie. And I knew this brother's name. His name was Ricky. Yeah. And to what you were saying, Ricky was somebody that I met while I was doing some summer. It was a visiting professorship over at UCSF and the Center for AIDS Prevention Studies. And we did 3 summers of 6 weeks. And I met Ricky my first summer. And I remember writing a column for Arise magazine back in the day. So MacArthur Flournoy and Glenn Alexander, those brothers were doing a wonderful magazine back then. And I had a health column back then. So shout out to them. They
gave me my first publication.
Yeah, making a magazine back then that was specifically for same-gender loving people of African descent. And I remember doing a article on depression. And I talked about how when I was in San Francisco, I didn't have my friends with me. I was dating somebody at the time in Atlanta. He wasn't around, but we would try to communicate via phone. And
That's more for FaceTime and Skype and all
it was
that.
before FaceTime and Skype, so you couldn't really see stuff. But we did have like a Logitech camera,
Oh,
and so we could actually do those kind of things. But we didn't do it just to keep in touch. We do it for more freaky stuff. But that's
okay.
besides the point. That's another.
Save that for the 100th subscriber.
That's a completely different story. But what happened was that I started to notice that I wasn't going out as much. I was staying to myself. I wasn't talking. I just seemed to have like a cloud over me for a little while. And I remember speaking to Ricky, and Ricky was so forthcoming about his struggles with depression, but he was really out there. And he said, I'm going to talk about my depression because I go through phases with it. I go up and down, but this is something that I'm grappling with. I'm trying to help myself with, and I'm going to overcome it. So I guess in my mind, I thought, one, he inspired me. So it was like, okay, well, maybe I need to take a look at myself. And these, like, depression isn't, you're crying all the time and you're this, that, and the other. It could be that you have a short fuse and you get angry quicker. It could be that you stop doing the things that you normally love to do. It could be that you can't sleep, or you sleep too much, you eat too much, or you eat too little. Like, those kind of things can all mean depression. It doesn't kind of always manifest the way it does in the movies and on TV. And so I remember looking at some subtle things with me, and I was like, I may be depressed, but I was so inspired by him. And I said, wow, Ricky's really upfront about this. Like, I can kind of talk about this in a public setting, write an article, publish it in Arise, and really bring it to the forefront. And then he committed suicide, which was absolutely crazy. And again, I know it's a cliche nowadays on social media. We say, check in with the strong ones, but it's absolutely true in some cases that people who are the poster children, the people that come out and vocal a lot, don't get that confused with that all that shit is under control, or that they don't have their struggles, or we don't have our struggles when we're more vocal about it in a public setting. I think we have to get over that fact, or think about those of us that are representing, especially mental health causes in the public eye. I think that automatically, because we're showing this power in a public setting, that we don't retreat back to ourselves at home and then struggle with the same things.
Do you think that it's still taboo to talk about mental health and suicide in the Black community?
Oh yeah. People still think we're crazy. I've spoken to some of my mentees recently. Like, you could have somebody list to you, I'm going through this transition, this trauma, and I'd be like, have you spoken to anybody about it? Why do I need to speak to anybody about it? And these are people who are in the field, in the public health field, in the HIV field, in the medical field, and we don't even get our shit together. So if we can't recognize that we need help at some point because we're too busy saving everybody else, what do you think everyone else in the community is thinking? They're not going to be doing it either. So I do still think there's a stigma attached to it, and it's unfortunate. I don't think it's as bad as, like, if you go to see a therapist, you're crazy. It's not that bad anymore, but I think people do have a stigma to it.
I see Marcus is with us. Marcus Stanley says hello, everyone.
Hey, Marcus. Happy belated to you too.
Oh, his birthday. Marcus, your birthday is in August too, huh?
He was dancing. He had a video of him dancing.
That is such a great way to celebrate your birthday.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's something that we talk about, but the conversation does often seem to me very detached. I think it is hard to talk about our intimate experiences.
Right.
One of the things I was also saying is that I know so many Black gay men that had early suicide attempts as kids, as like 9, 10, 11. They report like being very young, having significant depression, even sometimes having suicidal thoughts at like 10, and I'm like, well, what is that about?
Right.
Like, what is it? And I guess it does follow us.
Right.
In so many ways.
So I guess, we could throw out to the audience too, like, what do you guys do? Do suicidal thoughts ever creep into your head? And this is a space where you can talk about it and say, hey, it did creep in my head. Or were there friends of yours, family members, where they mentioned suicide, and how did you handle it? Did you immediately spring into action? Did you try to talk to them? Did you refer them someplace? Did you kind of brush it off and say, oh, girl, you lying? Or, you ain't really thinking about doing that, Or did you think, I can't believe that someone like that would be considering suicide, and then kind of move on? Like, how do you guys has it been something that's been in your experience, your lived experience recently, either personally or through friends and family? And what did you do when it came up?
And I also wonder, what kind of advice do we give? So when we're with people and they share maybe suicidal thoughts, do we say to them, oh, you just need to, I don't know, try not to think about it? Do we say to them things like, you should just chant and do affirmations?
Right.
Like, do we say to them, or do we freeze up?
Right.
Do we freeze up and not really know what to say
Because you don't know what to do.
or what to do?
And also, I think it's
Mhm.
hard because I think the stereotypical version of suicide is that someone overdoses on pills, someone puts a gun to their head, someone jumps
Mhm.
off a bridge. In my experience, the suicide that I've seen has been more of a prolonged, insidious um, walk to death. So
Mm.
people start doing small things to kind of start checking out. And it could be
Yeah.
doing stuff to get fired from their job, not taking care of their day to day responsibilities. If they have a health condition, letting it kind of fall to the side. And so this happens over weeks to months to sometimes years. And if you're not paying attention or if you're not getting involved at a certain point, all of a sudden it's going to reach that point where someone on social media says, "Oh, so and so's in the hospital." And you're thinking this shit just happened immediately. But if you look
Mm.
back, you could
The
see
signs
that
for them.
slowly it was kind of moving. So I think when we talk about suicide, we can talk about how people do stuff like that. And it even brought into mind, just as I was talking now, about how people do this like suicide by cop. Like you've heard stories about that. Like people know that cops are going to act up and they'll shoot you if you do this. And especially for black men, I've heard stories where someone will say, "I'm just going to do this and I'm going to go into this situation with a gun and be acting crazy. And I know the cops are going to shoot me."
Mm.
And so people know that. And so they'll do those kind of things. But there's all different ways that people think about it. And I think there are ways we have to kind of brainstorm ways in which we can kind of intervene at certain points. Um, and that means checking in on friends and
Mm.
family. That means making it connected. Like I think we were having a conversation with Johnny and Alvin earlier about making sure. Charles made the great point that as black gay men, we tend to put our social groups in compartments. Like we have our fuck buddies here, our boo here, our friends here that we travel with, our friends here that we tell all our ratchet stuff with, our work people. And sometimes they don't really know each other or see each
Mm.
other. And so if there's some way, Johnny was saying, to kind of make these groups know each other, and even with your family, your biological family, so that your mother, father, sisters, brothers know some of these people in these circles, then they can kind of connect. And so I think between having all these networks of people who care about you, if they're connected, then if all of a sudden you fall off and you don't go to work, or you're missing for a couple of days, or usually you're posting on social media every day, one of the people in those groups is going to say, "Hey, something's wrong, like so and so didn't post today, or so and so didn't do this today," and then contact, say, the mother or the brother or
Mm.
the fuck boy, who knows what it may be, but just somebody in those circles so that they can be connected and not so much disjointed.
Mm. David, when do you think would be a so we also recognize that depression and it can also be chemical.
Sure.
Um, when do you think someone should consider um, managing their perhaps the deteriorating mental health
With meds.
with meds? Yeah.
Um, the thing they teach, and I mean, there are different ways to approach this, but the thing that they teach you in medical school and just in general medicine is that when you start to have like physical, what they call somatic symptoms that affect your body. So you're sleeping, you can't get up for work, you're having headaches all the time. Some people manifest depression or anxiety with abdominal pain or joint pain, and you just can't function. When it gets to a point where you really can't function the way you're used to, the way you're accustomed to, then that's a time where you could use medications. And I was just talking about this with someone the other day who was a student who was on antidepressants for I think 9 years,
Mhm.
and that's a long time to be on antidepressants. And usually the teaching that I got was to say, keep it on for like 3 months, 6 months, maybe up to a year, to kind of get those physical symptoms under control. But then it's got to be coordinated with some kind of counseling, whether a case manager, social worker, therapist, something like that. Because the longer term things, and I think this is where it gets really muddy, is that you talk about like neurotransmitters and things in the brain that can chemical imbalances in the brain that lead to depression or anxiety or even suicidal ideation. But we don't understand the connection of how social stressors, cultural violence, structural violence, racism, homophobia, all those kind of things trigger those chemicals to become imbalanced. And so I think that's where a lot of the research is really lacking, because there's kind of a gray area there. But usually the medications will help to kind of defray if someone is actively suicidal or if they have physical symptoms.
Yeah. Art just shared add in religion, drugs, socioeconomics, it's a perfect storm.
Yeah.
So again, I think that goes into the point about, are there mental health professionals that are equipped to talk about and support you through, like, what happens when you're suicidal because of racism and homophobia. And I realize that structural things may manifest differently, but I just feel like, how do you have a conversation about mental health that doesn't add in structural? Art also shares that we had a 22-year-old newly diagnosed young man just commit suicide in January.
Yeah.
So yeah, 22 years old. So
Yeah.
it's definitely something that.
Yeah, and I remember 2 years ago when there was a young brother who was black and gay in Piedmont Park hung himself, and they ruled it a suicide. But there was so much shit going on. I think Philandro Castile had just been murdered by some cops. This was like 2 years ago. So all this other stuff was going on. And so we were all speculating that it was the KKK, there was some kind of racist stuff, white supremacist groups. And it seemed like there were a lot of people that were in denial, even when they look back at his social media stuff that said how much he was struggling with his mother. His mother didn't accept him because he was gay. All these other things were happening. And we still kind of clung to the narrative because it's such a resonating image with us.
My thing was always, well, I mean, suicide can also be murder in a sense to me. Like, it can still be a form of state violence.
Right.
And so for me, in my mind, I obviously made a connection between the murder that happens at the hands of the police state and one committing suicide,
Right.
but in a sense to me, still another manifestation
Right.
of structural violence. But what I found really heartbreaking was that when they thought his death was because of, a more, I guess, a more legible form of racial violence, he had this community behind him. There was this outrage and support. But when it was ruled that he was just a young black man that committed suicide, it disappeared. It's like no one wanted to touch it, which was just really, I think, really heartbreaking.
Yeah. And I mean, you can almost see how someone would get brought to that point if you feel that. And like you said, like all the violence that we see manifested, and this could be structural violence from the church, from religious groups, from our communities, from our teachers, from our educators, from the general white community, from the general gay community, from the black gay community in and of itself, from the social apps, the networking apps, the hookup apps, like all those things can kind of contribute. And so like you're saying, they don't pull the trigger, or they don't, put your head in, in the noose, but they have blood on their hands in that respect, because they kind of lead it to this point. Like you could say this young brother took his own life, but there were a lot of forces that were going around him that really led him to that point.
Yeah.
So,
and how do we, how do we build communities where we're able to have these conversations, we're able to support each other, where we're able to have mental health professionals that are equipped to deal with the, how we show up and manifest.
Yeah, I think it's hard. And we were talking earlier about having like black men or just black professionals, psychological or therapy or case manager professionals, and they're hard to find.
Have you ever had a black male therapist, or Alvin or John? Have you ever had black male therapists? Was that on purpose, or?
I've never had a black male therapist either.
Really?
But I know there are good ones around. And I mean, we were talking about, if y'all haven't checked out that article in the New York Times about 2 or 3 days ago that talked about how they did a study where black men seem to accept preventive measures suggested by doctors if the recommendation was coming from other black men, like a black male doctor, rather than a white male doctor or an Asian doctor. And so I think it's something that we've known the whole time, but like if you feel some kind of connectedness with the person that's providing the health information, that's providing the treatment, that's providing whatever, you feel more comfortable, you may trust them more, and then you may be able to do things. I think it's just getting through the door, but I almost have a feeling that there are so few black therapists out there that they probably get overly saturated.
I know a lot of black gay men will say that they prefer to have a black woman therapist. I've heard that a lot.
I've had a black female therapist, and she was great.
Yeah,
she was great.
Good experiences. I don't know. I feel like I think it would be interesting. I think, but I think there's something to continually unpack. But I absolutely think that whoever the therapist is, they should have some sensitivity to, the role that racism and homophobia will undoubtedly play in your life and how it can contribute to poor mental health.
That's interesting. I'm just thinking about in that article from the New York Times, there were a bunch of comments afterwards.
Oh, got into the comment section.
And there was a white gay man that said, as a gay man, I like going to another gay doctor, or I prefer to go to another gay doctor. But he said this tribalism of black men preferring to go to black men has to stop.
Which might have aroused him a little bit.
Yeah, it probably did. No. But he was basically making the point that, just because, gay men have been persecuted and, this, that, and the other for centuries. And I was like, and black people have, like, you're comparing gay persecution in the United States to slavery. Like, how does that work? And so we just need to get over these and deal with the best provider. And I was like, that's a bunch of bullshit. It seems like we're comfortable talking about how women may be more comfortable with a female provider or woman provider. Gay people be more comfortable with a gay provider. But we nut up when we say, oh, a black person or a black male prefers to have a black male provider. All of a sudden we get uncomfortable.
I think that's because in our culture, the needle might have moved in some ways around an appreciation for diversity, an appreciation for POC, whatever. But I think there's still very acceptable and rampant anti-blackness. Like, I'm always amazed at how, and I'm not saying that, we've gotten there. I know there's still a lot of stuff with racism. Like, I'm not even pretending, or even diversity and so forth. But I do feel like there's been some movement around discussions around diversity, or some, even though it's, very superficial, et cetera. Right. So mostly benefits white folks. Right. But yeah, like, he can say that because he doesn't have, like, there's still and I think it's very much related to mental health. And why, we have poor mental health outcomes too, perhaps. Yeah. But I see we're almost at the time. I was looking at the Trevor Project. They actually provide support for LGBT youth. Mm-hmm. I'm looking at their website now. Mm-hmm. Because I was also looking like, well, what are some good resources? Mm-hmm.
That was the one that I found too. Mm-hmm. That's great.
Yeah, it says it was founded in 1998 by the creators of the short film Trevor. So, I mean, definitely, I think that if you are struggling, please reach out to folks if you can. If you know someone, and even as importantly, if you know folks in your life, if you think someone is struggling, please reach out. Please. I know maybe sometimes people might feel a little awkward to even have the conversation, to raise the conversation. I mean, I think that's one of those moments where you really should, ask for forgiveness and not permission.
Right.
So please, 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 if you know folks, just reach out. Just reach out. I mean, I think that we all need to do that.
Yeah, I would add to that, if you're struggling, if you feel yourself slipping, doing something different that you don't do, or not enjoying the things you normally do, or those thoughts are kind of creeping into your head, reach out to somebody. It doesn't have to be everybody. You don't have to go on social media and tell everybody, but find one person that you really trust and reach out to them and let them know exactly what you're going through. If you can bring that one person, that person can give you a lifeline. You mentioned the Trevor Project. There is a phone number. I think I have this right. It's 866-488-7386. Again, that's 866-488-7386. And that's a suicide hotline, I think, that they use. And they're very specific towards LGBT youth. But I mean, obviously, every generation will be included. But I think the first part is to kind of recognize what's going on. I think some of us have the self-efficacy and we have the internal strength to be able to pull ourselves out of it sometimes. But many of us don't. Yeah. And so, even if you don't have the strength to kind of pull yourself out, at least being able to muster the strength to kind of reach out to somebody may be helpful. And like Charles was saying, I think, family and friends kind of check in on each other.
Absolutely.
Again, check in on the strong ones, like we say all the time. But like, don't get it twisted. There's somebody who's the strongest one in your group, or was always the one that's, helping everybody else.
Yeah, or the one that you think, you assume that because of their external trappings that they don't struggle, or you assume that just because of the car they drive or the house they live in, or
they have a good job.
They have a a good job.
And they didn't have any hardship growing up. They didn't go through what other people say they went through, that they're okay. They may not be.
They may not be. All right. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. I really appreciate having this conversation with you. Next week, what's our topic going to be?
Prep. So next week, I almost feel like a news anchor where you talk about something really depressing, and the news anchor will be like, "So and so died." Da 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 da. Next, this little furry dog. I'm sorry about that, but I didn't mean to change the tone that quickly. But we are going to be talking about prep next week.
Prep.
Black Gay Pride is Labor Day weekend here in Atlanta. So I think, are we doing a studio audience? Are we doing a live studio?
No, we're not
audience?
going to do a live audience this time. But
Okay.
we'll definitely do it again soon.
We're gonna have a special guest.
We have a special guest.
His name is Dr. Quentin Robinson. He works for Absolute Care.
Dr. Quentin.
And Quentin is an amazing internal medicine and infectious disease doctor who does HIV and STI treatment. And he also does a lot of work with PrEP. So I think between the three of us, we'll be able to unpack some of the stuff with PrEP, some of the options, and maybe if some of y'all are interested.
Bring me some PrEP?
I'm gonna bring you some prep. If some of y'all coming down for Labor Day weekend, want to kind of protect yourselves, if
we should talk about PEP too.
Yeah, post-exposure prophylaxis as well. We'll talk about both those things while we're there. But next week, please tune in Wednesday at 7 p.m.
Tune in, same time, same show.
It'll be wonderful.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much.
We'll see y'all later.